Hello, everyone. I am Badr Mandri, economist at the Policy Center for the New South. And I'm very excited to be joined in this interview by Mr. Ugo Panizza, a distinguished economist and professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. So, Professor, I welcome you as a specialist in sovereign debt issues to discuss recent developments surrounding this topic in this context of the coronavirus crisis. So to start, as you know, recently we've seen a number of red flags coming from the IMF, which announced 2 weeks ago that over than 100 countries have called its emergency financing facilities to deal with the health crisis and its economic impacts. We've also seen the IIF, the Institute of International Finance, report that countries issued more debt than ever in last April. So how worried should we be? And can we talk about a looming debt crisis?
I think we should be very worried. So the situation is very bad. So this is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. It might end up being bigger than the Great Depression. And it's a global crisis in the sense that even countries which have a relatively small number of infections will suffer a very large economic cost of the crisis because of spillover through commodity prices, tourism, capital flows, or whatever. So we should be worried. Your specific question is about that. And my expectation is that 1 year down the road, there will be a wave of sovereign defaults all around the world. We entered the crisis with already a few countries with debt troubles, Argentina, Lebanon, Ecuador, and there will be many more in 12 months.
Yes, yeah. So the risks are there, and especially for low-income countries. And in response to this, this increasing risk, the international community has reacted quickly. And by the way, this is one of the few positive points that can be attributed to the global governance in the management of this crisis. So here I'm talking about the G20 initiative for the suspension of debt repayment for the poorest countries. I would like to hear your views on this initiative and how effective it can be, given that so far it concerns only bilateral debts, and we know that bilateral debt is weighting less and less in the debt structure of these low-income countries.
So as you said, the international community was very quick. Soon after we realized how important the crisis was, the managing director of the IMF and the president of the World Bank called for a standstill on bilateral debt. The G20 supported this call, and there was a decision exactly to postpone payment on all bilateral debt for all. So for all countries, for all IDA borrowing countries, so these are countries which have access to the concessional facility of the World Bank, which tend to be low-income countries, but there are also some non-low-income countries here. And one country which is not classified, which is not an IDA country, which is Angola. And so there was this decision of a standstill on the bilateral debt of these countries, so IDA countries plus Angola. The total amount of debt which has been frozen is about $14 billion. So that's good. The bad thing is what you mentioned, that this initiative only focuses on bilateral debt, and it does not require the private sector to participate in this standstill. These countries owe about, need to roll over and pay interest during 2020 for about 8 billion to private creditors. So it's a lot of money, but it's not, it's smaller compared to the bilateral creditors. The big issue here that so there are two issues here. The number one is that it's a bit ironic that the official sector is going to do a standstill, and some of these funds will be used to pay the private creditors. So that seems a bit ironic to some of us. And the second thing is that if this is going to be a template, in a few months, we might start seeing middle-income countries needing this type of standstill. And when we move to middle-income countries, the share of that owed to private creditor becomes much larger. And if this is a blueprint of what has been done now, is a blueprint for the way we will deal for middle-income country, it's a very bad blueprint, because in this case, we'll not be able to address the largest part of the debt that's coming due. So these are the two issues. So that's a great initiative, but it's unfortunate that there was not a stronger call for private sector participation in this initiative.
Yes, of course. You mentioned in your introduction some specific countries where the debt crisis started long before the coronavirus crisis. Firstly, Lebanon, which is experiencing the worst economic recession in its history, and which declared payment defaults in last March. And secondly, Argentina, which is asking for a debt restructuring only 5 years after the end of its last crisis. And I remember you told me during our last meeting that this country remains a textbook case. So with the amplifying effect of the coronavirus, how do you see the situation of these two countries in the next few years?
So let me start with Lebanon. Lebanon is really a tragic case, in my view. So Lebanon is a country that has defied gravity for a very long time. The first time I wrote a paper saying there is going to be a crisis in Lebanon, it was in 2001. So, and for many years, Lebanon was able to go ahead, service its debt, avoid a crisis, and many people were puzzling how this could happen. And but eventually, like all the things that at some point needs to happen, it happened. And the fact that it took so long to happen has led to a crisis which is truly massive. So Lebanon right now has a debt crisis, has a banking crisis, has a balance of payment crisis, has a currency crisis, and so the situation, and with already an underlying humanitarian crisis, with being in a very complicated neighborhood, with having 1 million, more than 1 million Syrian refugees in the country. So it's like 25% of the population. So I always tell this, my friends in Italy are worried about the number of immigrants in Italy. They say, if you put the proportion that Lebanon has, would mean like, something like 20 million refugees in Italy. And so it's huge. So the situation there is really bad. I've been looking at, I care about Lebanon. My wife is Lebanese. I lived in Lebanon, so I know the country fairly well. And I'm really, really worried about the country, and I don't see any easy exit out of it. And then on top, as you said, there is the coronavirus thing, which is like, it's really the perfect storm. And so I don't know what's going to happen. Argentina, as you said, is sort of a textbook case. It's the country with the largest number of defaults. in history. It's a country that defaulted in the early 90s. In the late 80s. It restructured in the early 90s. It defaulted again. It went into default in 2001. Came out from default in the mid 2000s, and now it's back to it. So the case in Argentina, well, it's bad. I don't think it's as tragic as the case in Lebanon. So Argentina always defaulted with lower level of debt than in the case of Lebanon. It's also a country which has a more solid economy at the background, but it's gonna be it's gonna be painful there too. They just proposed an exchange a couple of days ago. It was last week, I think. It's a fairly brutal exchange. The haircut is again very high, like the one offered in the last default. It's interesting because the IMF came out with a document saying, it's not going to get better than this. Creditors take this haircut. There was an interview of a senior IMF staffer from the Western Hemisphere department. I know maybe it can pay a little bit more. So we will see.
Well, so Professor, perhaps one of the positive effects of this confinement is that it has stimulated somehow some reflection. And recently there has been a great theoretical debate about what we call debt monetization. Some economists propose a monetization of a part of the domestic public debt in order to alleviate some constraints on the government budget financing and on public debt. And of course, we know the inflationary risk that this implies. But in your opinion, in this context of crisis, economic downturn, low inflation, can we tolerate recourse to such an instrument, in particular for in developing countries such as Morocco, where, for your information, domestic debt counts for about 2/3 of total public debt and represents more than 50% of GDP?
So I think it's a very risky strategy.
Yeah.
So let's start from one basic fact. The central bank, people and government need real resources. The central bank cannot create these resources. The only thing that the central bank can create is money. Now, if the central bank, so at the end, real resources need, real government expenditure of the service of the debt needs to be paid with real resources, which needs to be taxes. So what debt monetization can do two things. If you have a credible central bank, it's just a postponement of taxes. It's just saying, I cannot tax now, I issue money. This money does not generate inflation because somehow people believe that the central bank will mop up the money at some point later in the thing. And these resources will be provided through taxation. So in this case, that monetization might work because it's simply a way of smoothing taxation over time. This is the central bank is credible. If the central bank is not credible, that monetization will lead to inflation. Inflation is a tax, is a tax on money.
Yes.
Is a tax which is not very transparent, is a tax which is not decided by the parliament, is a tax that tends to be regressive. And that's why I think it's a risky strategy. So again, the point that I want to make, I think this idea that by printing money, the central bank can create resources that are not there, it's a wrong idea. The central bank can only do two things. Postpone taxation, if the central bank is credible, or tax through inflation. In any case, this debt will need to be backed by some form of taxation. And you know, and again, and if you have a credible central bank and you can use it to postpone taxation, that's great. But there are not so many credible central banks around. So I see this strategy in emerging market countries as a risky strategy. And then, of course, nothing is ever black and white. You can always push a little bit the thing, but you need to be careful.
Thank you. Thank you for this answer. I have maybe one last question that may also be of interest to our decision makers here in Morocco. Like many countries, our government will certainly issue debt in the next few months. If you have to advise our government, does this moment of crisis seem to you opportune to issue debt? If yes, what type of rate, fixed or variable, and what maturity would you recommend?
So that's that's a difficult question. I read a little bit about Morocco before talking with you, but I'm clearly not an expert of the situation of Morocco, and I'm sure that you have the people in your debt management office are much better suited than me. Now, if you know, if you can issue debt in domestic currency at a reasonable interest rate, I think that's always preferable. Yeah. Now, it really depends what are the trade-offs involved. Clearly, if the debt in domestic currency implies a real interest rate which is 5 percentage point higher than the debt in foreign currency, then I would go with debt in foreign currency. I would try to issue long-term debt again if I'm able to borrow at a real interest rate, at a reasonable interest rate. But again, I don't really know enough about what type of situation Morocco is facing right now. And the only thing that I could say that one should evaluate carefully the various trade-offs, not to go foreign currency just because foreign currency is a bit cheaper, when it's realized that foreign currency debt it's often cheaper ex ante, could end up being more expensive ex post. And so one needs to consider these elements.
Okay.
I think Morocco was also, given that Morocco is a country with good policy, it was good that it had access to this precautionary line from IMF. I think this is helpful. So that's.
Okay, Mr. Panizza, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and sharing with us your insights. I hope to see you again very soon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully in Rabat next time.
Thank you.